All right, we are live. Welcome everybody. My name is Scott. This is Drawing Together. We're with Artist Network. We meet every Wednesday, 3 p.m. Eastern, and we draw together. So this is what we're working on today. We've got this landscape. I worked on this in graphite, but feel free to use other materials as well. What I really would like to address in this drawing is the idea of kind of value octaves, kind of keying your values properly with the attempt of creating atmospheric perspective. So that's something that we haven't really addressed very much in this series, but we're going to try to use our control over value and value contrast to create depth in the subject. So if you want to follow along, you're going to find the reference image in the link below. So you can bring that up and follow along. These are the materials we're going to use. I just have the smooth white piece of paper. This is cut to an 8x10. I'm going to set this up here for now. And then I'm using a set of the Derwent Graphic Pencils, and I have the range that goes from 4H to a 6B. So we go from hard into soft, so light into dark. And we're going to be utilizing this range to help us control our values. Now I'm not going to use all of the pencils. What I like to do is kind of think about them in groups. So we have our lighter, harder materials, we have our kind of middles, and then we have our softer, darker ones. So once you get to the 4B, 5B, and 6B, they're very similar. And so I don't really like to really kind of pay too close of attention to which one I'm using. I like to, as long as it gives me the range of value that I need, I grab kind of something from within those buckets. So we'll actually start with one of the harder materials. I think I'm actually going to grab the H, primarily because it's going to show up a little bit better on camera than, let's say, the 3H or the 4H for the harder ones. And then as we get into it even farther, I'm going to bring in this Derwent Onyx pencil, which is even darker than the 6B that we have here, and that's going to allow me to get that full range of values that we want. Other materials that we're going to use are erasers. I've got the rubber eraser here, and I took some time I took a razor blade and I kind of carved this down just to give myself a sharp edge. It might come in handy as we get towards the end when we want to simulate some of the texture in the grass. We have this Kneaded eraser that has been well loved. You can see how dark it is, but it is still going to be workable. So if you're kind of new to drawing and you haven't used these materials, the Kneaded eraser is really handy for a lot of applications, and it can last you a long time. And then finally, our remaining material that we need today is the blending stump that we have here. So I use that quite a bit. We'll see how it plays out today. So let's get to it. If you have any questions, feel free to type it out. If you type it in all caps, it helps me to see it a little bit more easily, and I can make sure that I address it properly. I love just to hear where you're from, where you're viewing from, if you're following along, what materials you might be using. If you choose to do this in charcoal, for example, or I've seen some of you have been posting work in color. We did the puffin last week, and I saw some nice colored work there. So you don't have to follow along exactly like this. This is really a chance for us to get together and share our own experiences. And I like to talk through my thought process as I go through to see if it helps you. So we'll get going. I'm not seeing any questions, so I don't want to delay any farther. Happy holidays to everybody. If you're viewing from the US, we have Thanksgiving tomorrow already. There's still more to get done for that. So, all right. So I said I'm going to start with this H pencil, and I'm going to use this to just to start to map out the basic structure of the drawing. It's going to be really light, and I'm going to do my best to try to get past it pretty quickly. So if you're just joining us, the first half hour is going to look very light, and you may not see a whole lot on the page. But I'm just going to make some kind of large statements on the page about where these objects are going to go, the basic structure. So we've got the mountains on the right. We've got this general shoreline down in here. I'm looking quickly back and forth between the reference photo and the drawing. When I'm looking at the reference photo, that's when I'm taking in kind of specific information about the angle and the kind of the placement of the forms. And I'm just glancing at the page mostly to give myself a an orientation point. Make sure I'm kind of in the right spot. I've got this mountain back in here. I'm just going to give myself an initial kind of axis. So as I'm starting to kind of work through the drawing, I'm also making mental note of how I want to kind of control the values. And noticing that we have this kind of mountain back in here that I really want to push back. And so I'm going to use lighter values there. Or actually, I want to kind of qualify that a little bit. I'm going to use lower contrast back there. So the general principle that I like to think about when working with atmospheric perspective is the idea that high contrast advances, low contrast recedes. So in general in the landscape, it gets lighter and brighter towards the background. But what happens is that the whites aren't quite as intense and then the darks get kind of washed out. So you end up with a very narrow range in your values. If you're new to drawing and you're kind of confused by the terms we're using here, a value just simply refers to how light or dark a gray is on your page. So if you think about the scale ranging from white, to the white of the paper, all the way to the darkest you can get with your material, that's your value scale. And I like to think about kind of octaves in the drawing, in that you can key your drawing up or key your drawing down. So you can move it up into lighter values, you can move it down into darker values, and ultimately what we're looking at is a value relationship between things. And so again, that's something that we're going to explore as we go through. It's a little bit difficult to describe now when we don't have much to look at on the page. So I'm just going to start to block things in, and then as we get more specific and as we get into some of these areas, it's going to make more sense what we're referring to in terms of value. So the main distinction I want to make at this point is the difference in value between the sky and then the land. So I kind of did a rough kind of block in with the with the pencil, using some line work to kind of give myself a roadmap. And now I'm just kind of filling that in with this light value. One of the things that I also want to I'm thinking of at this point is that I'm going to need to use the white of the page for the lightest parts in the sky. There's some clouds that we can see in the sky area. Those are going to be the white of the page. That means the rest of the sky is going to be actually darker in value. I'm not going to tone the page at this point, but you might find it helpful. What I want to do is kind of just think about this large mass, get something on the page, and then I can adjust it from there. So kind of doing cross-hatching. I'm allowing the marks to kind of cross over one another, and now I'm just going to wipe it down. Actually, I'm going to let it start to tone the paper. I'm not worried about preserving the white of the page in the sky. I want that to actually build up kind of a haze. That kind of softens everything, and now I'm going to take another stab at it. And I'm using this overhand grip intentionally. Ooh, that got a little heavy right there. I'm using this overhand grip intentionally because it utilizes the side of the pencil, and it makes a kind of a less permanent mark, and it encourages me just to stay focused on the large areas rather than getting bogged down in any details at this point. And I'm taking in kind of some of the landmarks here. So generally, let me see, I want to orient myself looking for this line that runs kind of across the base of the mountain. There's a general path. It's not a very clear line, but this line right here, it's a little low compared to what I'm seeing in the reference photo, but pretty close. I think I'm going to let it sit for now. I'm not going to really raise it. But this kind of just represents a line across the bottom. We have some kind of dark trees in this area, and here we have this hillside that comes down to meet it. And what I want to do is, I don't want to get too detailed in here, because as I work on this area back here, this is all going to get lost. It's going to get picked up on my palm. So I don't want to spend any time really on this area down here. I want to make sure that I'm oriented properly. But I know that this is all going to get smudged and I'm going to get lost. And so I'm going to not spend a whole lot of time. I just need to give myself enough information to make sure that things are laying on the page properly. Medieval Peasant is asking about what makes good negative space. That's an interesting question. If you're kind of new to that term, the terms positive and negative space can be really helpful when you're establishing a composition, as well as when you're controlling your proportions. So a positive space refers to anything that is the object that you're drawing. Negative space is the shape around it. So if we look at this mountain, for example, that would refer to this as the positive space, and then the shape that is created by the sky around it, that's the negative space. In general, what makes shapes pleasing is a certain amount of asymmetry, especially in the landscape, just because symmetrical forms rarely exist. They become less prominent. And you're looking for a certain amount of visual rhythm. And so there are lots of kind of guidelines, like rule of thirds and breaking things into 1/3. So for example, if this landmass represents 1/3 of the volume being taken up by the page, then the sky might represent 2/3, or vice versa. Sometimes splitting it 50-50 can be pleasing. I want to make sure, though, that I kind of qualify that a little bit, because I think you should always be utilizing your intuition with regards to that. Those theories were developed through an observation of intuition. It started from intuition first, and then scientists and artists, philosophers took some time to understand that intuition and come up with theories of why we might find certain things pleasing. And we have a tendency in our minds to turn those into rules that kind of must be followed more strictly. And I just want to kind of come back to the idea that it all originates based on what is pleasing to the eye and the mind, and if we connect with that in ourselves, that can be what ultimately guides us. So hopefully that makes sense. So I'm using this overhand grip to just kind of block things in. And one of the things I'm doing is I start to lay in the shape of where the river is going to go. I want to do a quick check-in with various landmarks that recede in space. So we have the river here, and we have certain kind of clumps of grass. If I run a vertical line through that, I can see where it passes through this next hillside. I can continue that vertical line up, and I can see how does that align with that distant mountain there, because I haven't really placed that distant mountain yet. I'm just giving myself landmarks in the foreground from which I'll build those mountains in the background. Nia's asking about the pencils. This is what we're using right now. I'm using the Graphic, the 6B to 4H Derwent. I enjoy it quite a bit. And then there is another question. What are my favorite pencils to work with? I've been working with these Derwents now for several weeks. I really like them. I was using some kind of Prismacolor ebony pencils for a while. I was also using the Soho brand, which I believe are the Jerry's kind of brand, Jerry's Artorama brand, and they all are good. What I think is important to look at is how does it lay on the page? Is it relatively smooth? Is it scratchy? And I find that these Derwents are working out really well, and so I'm really having a lot of fun exploring that. Okay, so I'm just looking at this basic shape. One of the other things I kind of forgot to mention that I'm doing is I'm intentionally blurring my vision. So everything is out of focus right now. So when I look at the subject matter, I just see these large shapes. So what happens is if you squint your eyes, that reduces the amount of light that enters into your eyes. It helps to activate the rods in the back of your eye there, on your retina, and those are more sensitive to intensity of light. It correlates to value a little bit more directly than color. And so if you squint your eyes and you reduce the amount of light entering your eyes, you can generally see the large value shapes more effectively. And it kind of dissuades me from trying to explore details too early. So I'm going to use this line here. There's this middle ground line that is really dynamic in the composition. It comes down here, kind of levels out a little bit on this side, and then we have specific angles that come up that represent these two hillsides here. And I'm going to allow this to be kind of my anchor for the composition. So I want to start to make these a bit more specific. Kind of comparing the reference image to the drawing. You may find it helpful to actually have them vertically next to one another, and you can just move back and forth on top of it. Medieval Peasant is asking, is negative space empty? Negative space, I mean, I guess it could be empty, but it's my belief, and the way I conceive of my drawings is that everything needs to be active in the drawing, and it doesn't necessarily mean that there's actually marks being made in a space, but it should play a role in the composition, and it shouldn't feel as empty space, or be like as essentially unfinished space. So sometimes an area, it completes a drawing or a painting to have it left open, but it should read as intentional to the viewer. And so this is where it comes down to, again, to kind of intuition. And if you're looking at an area and it feels like an object is just floating in space with no kind of relationship to its environment, then you might consider working that environment a little bit more. Sometimes it can make the subject more dramatic and dynamic to have it kind of floating in a space. But again, it should be an intentional decision as opposed to something that's ignored. So hopefully that makes sense. All right, so what I'm doing is, as I look at this hillside, I want to be thinking about two things at once. There's the general angle, and then it gets broken down into smaller parts. It kind of gradually shifts between concave and convex. I'm going to change up the direction of my marks so I don't make them too directional. And I'm just thinking about them as a solid shape, and as we go through it, we'll eventually add some of the nuances, and you can see in the reference photo there's some variations in value in here that we want to address, but right now I wanted to see it as a large mass, and I'm not worried about matching the values one-to-one. I just want to get the basic value relationships established so that this is darker than that. And then we'll make those more specific as we go along. So again, kind of wiping this down, this helps to smooth out the drawing, smooth out those marks, and it also helps to build up that tone from which we'll erase out the clouds. All right, so I'm feeling pretty confident in this so far, in this general shape here. It feels a little bit tight in here. So I may end up having to, let me see if I think I need to move this over a little bit. Give myself a little bit more room for those mountains in there. And I'm using, so the center of the drawing should just be right about here. So if I take this, carry that across, all right, so that's working out pretty well. So if this is the center of the drawing here, roughly, actually right about here, I can kind of then focus on just this area here in the reference photo, divide that even farther, see where that puts me. And there's this one tree that kind of stands out to me that I might put on there. This just becomes a landmark for me that I can use as a point of reference. I can use a plumb line. If I draw a vertical line through that, I can see where it intersects that hill line, and that helps to give me some sort of orientation for this background hill. So again, building up some of that haze. Actually, I might need to lay down some value up in the sky a little bit. So just get some on there. And I'm just using the palm of my hand to wipe down. If you want to use like a chamois cloth, paper towel, something like that, that might work better for you. Hello, everybody from all over the place. All right, let's see. Oh, and then Thomas, I wanted to get back to your question about did I consider using tone paper? I did consider using tone paper, and I chose to use this white paper in part because I had already done a mountain scene using the toned paper. And so if you haven't seen it, I can't remember which episode it is, but I already have one that utilizes that, and this is going to help me kind of I think describe the octaves in value that I was referring to earlier. So so with this kind of roughly blocked in, I'm going to start kind of finishing this mountain back in here. And I'm going to start by first establishing the intersection points. Where did the mountains emerge from behind this hillside? And then where do they end up on this other side? Doing some angle sighting to find this angle here between those two intersection points. And then kind of establishing a general shape, and then we'll go through and make that more specific. And so for me, I think finding those intersection points is really helpful in controlling the scale relationships at a distance, especially in something large like this. Because what can happen is that our brain knows that these mountains are actually larger than what's in the foreground, but you can see that optically, based on what we're seeing in the photograph, it's taking up a much smaller portion of the picture plane. And so our brain can sometimes have a hard time carrying both of those thoughts at the same time, and we say, that's a bigger mountain, I'm going to make it larger than it actually is. So that using these intersection points can be a helpful way of managing that. So I'm still sticking with this H pencil, and I want to try to get rid of any sort of outlines. So I have kind of a rough idea of where those edges are going to be, and I want to just block in that basic form at this point. And one of the things that's going to happen is that we're going to start to calibrate to the value range on the page. And so what was once kind of dark is going to eventually feel light. If you have a value scale, it could be helpful to actually have that out and available. It's just not something that I've ever really worked into my process to use a value scale. The cool thing about value is this is something I read in a book about neuroaesthetics, the study of how our brain interprets visual information, but we don't have the ability to interpret a value in isolation. It's always in the context of something else. So the correlation that is made is in the idea of perfect pitch. So somebody who has perfect pitch can hear a specific note out of context and identify it as a C or a D or whatever note that is. There is no equivalent when it comes to value, because it's always developed in terms of its relationship. It's how it relates to whatever's behind it. So you could take one value, put it on a light background, and it looks one way. You put it on against a dark background, and it looks completely different. And our brains are wired to interpret those relationships, not the specific value, which is really kind of a cool idea. All right, so just kind of blocking this in, and I'm going to force myself to not go any darker than this pencil can allow me to go. And I know based on this set here that it's going to give me a lighter value than anything up here in this range, in this the 4B, 5B, 6B. So I want to kind of keep that kind of in mind as I go forward. All right, and I think what I want to do is just kind of take this blending stump and just kind of knock down some of that texture. And work my way up to the edge of the hillside. And so what you might find helpful if you're trying to control the scale is kind of break this region down. Again, as we started by looking at these two intersection points here, and then you can divide that farther, and then divide that farther, and look at just those regions, and then try to gradually become more and more specific as you break those down into increasingly smaller portions. So right now, I've also hardly used any real pressure on the material. So this is just using the weight of the pencil. And then I'm going to go in and add some of the detail and the variety in on top of that. Now I could do some negative drawing here, using the eraser to kind of sharpen up this edge. And you're going to see it's going to leave this halo around there, but we're going to get rid of that. Now this is where I can start to become a bit more specific, looking at the curves along that edge. So I'm just taking a little bit of extra focus here. I guess that looks all right for that form. I might adjust it a little bit. So then I can take that palm of my hand, smudge that out a little bit, and that knocks down some of that white halo there and starts to smooth it out, but it gives me a bit more of a refined edge. If I need to refine this even farther, I can kind of build into it and make sure I grab the right pencil. Okay, so then now what I'm going to do is start to look at some of the darker shapes in here and just build up some additional layers. So just applying a little bit more pressure, still using this H pencil, because I know there's essentially a value limiter placed on this material. I can only go so dark. I know I can be fairly safe by utilizing this pencil and not get too dark and not increase the contrast. So what's happening in terms of creating that depth is that, and you can kind of see that there, if you look closely at those snowfields that are back up in this area, we understand them to be white, but optically they're actually darker in value than the white clouds behind it. So I'm not going to worry too much about those white snowfields at this point. I want to get these darker patches of trees in there. And you're going to ask yourself how precise you need to be with this. And one of the things I love about landscape painting is that it does kind of offer the opportunity to become a bit more impressionistic in that you can kind of react to how the proportions feel more than getting them 100% accurate versus, say, a portrait where slight variations in proportions can have a large impact. So you're still utilizing the side of the pencil. I want to be careful not to create too sharp and hard of an edge along this hillside. And I'm trying to think about kind of wrapping my marks around them. And this form has volume, and we can kind of pay attention to that. And so even as though it's back off on the distance, we can still kind of create it as a three-dimensional form. So I'm trying to imagine what that structure is, you know, as I run my pencil across the page here. Rather than thinking about it as actually being on the page, I'm thinking about it as though it's tracing over the mountain. I'm thinking about that volume. Now I'm going to press down a little bit harder. It gets darker in this area. And again, just utilizing the side of the pencil to suggest some of that texture more than getting in there with the point of the pencil and making too much detail. All right, and then there's some kind of darker forms. You can see that there's kind of patches in those trees back there. I can't remember where this was. It's somewhere up here in Colorado. And I wish I could remember specifically the spot. And I usually am able to do that, and I'm really racking my brain trying to remember where this was. And so as I'm making these marks here, it's suggesting these distant trees along that edge. That's starting to kind of suggest that hillside. We want to have some of these lost and found edges there that help to suggest the atmosphere and the depth. So Mary's asking, I don't use a kneaded eraser. I do use a kneaded eraser when I need to. So far, I haven't really needed to. So I only use the eraser at this point to establish this side here, and having that harder edge helped me better than the kneaded eraser would have. All right. So now I'm really utilizing the full weight of the pencil here, kind of gradually building up that. And now it's really cool to see, like, already, like, this is now darker than this. Earlier on, this was a noticeable shape. You know, I can feel that I'm calibrating my interpretation to the values to that. So I just need to kind of stick with this at this point. I know that, you know, by laying in that middle ground, that I can be pretty confident in the proportions, and I can stay in this area and know that it's going to work out okay. So I need to kind of trust that if I kind of stick with this game plan, it's going to serve me in the end. And I don't need to kind of work in the foreground and double check things. But in general, if I were painting this, I would have blocked in this area with a much darker value. Because what happens is, as I mentioned earlier, we're constantly adjusting our interpretation of values based on the relationships. So what appears relatively dark now will feel light later. And sometimes it's healthier to really block in those values early and then gradually refine them. But in this case, I'm just sticking in that background, trusting that it's going to be okay later on in the drawing, that it's not going to be too dark. But I don't want to go any lighter than that. Now what I want to, or any darker than that, I'm sorry. What I want to do is I want to erase out those snowfield areas. And I'm just going to kind of suggest them. I don't want to be too persnickety with them. And if you need to, though, if you would like to make them more precise, you can erase out a larger area, then just gently kind of fill in the negative space around them to make them more precise. And so, but I know we're already half an hour into this drawing, and so I want to move this thing along for everybody. Knock that value down a little bit more. What I love about doing this, just kind of building up a drawing and then wiping it down, is it helps to unify everything. So I don't run the risk of it feeling like a fractured landscape where these different elements feel like they're from different drawings all stuck together. This helps to keep everything together. All right, there is a bit of a noticeable kind of hillside in here that I want to suggest, but I don't know if I want to do much more detail than that. So what I'm looking at now as I look in the screen is the equivalent of stepping back from it. If you haven't done that yourself, you might find it helpful to do that. Let's see. I'm worried that that's too dark. So this is where I will pull out my kneaded eraser. So Mary, what I like to use the kneaded eraser for is to do this. So just kind of pressing and lifting. And if it lifts too much, then I can just lay in another pass of value here. But I like that a little bit as a kind of a soft transition, a little bit darker on this side, gradually getting lighter as we move over here to help suggest some of that atmosphere. And we can push the depth even farther by intentionally leaving detail out of here. So as I look at the reference photo, there's quite a bit going on that I can see clearly in the photo. And I'm asking myself now, like how much detail do I want to add? And I think I'm pretty much at the point where I want it to be. I want to really push this farther. Okay, so now, Ursula's asking, what am I using for the paper? This is the Hahnemühle 190. It's this right here that I've used before in the past. I really like it. But this is just a smooth, fairly heavy white drawing paper. So now I'm going to switch to, let me go to say the 3B. So we're going from now the H to the 3B. Let me pull this up here. So if this is our value scale from light to dark, we've jumped from here to here. So it's essentially moving up, like I like to refer to them as octaves, right? So then the value range available to me here is going to be even greater. I can get darker with this. Now, as I look in the reference photo, down in here, the values all seem to merge, and then they become more noticeably different as we move up the hillside. And so I want to switch to this. I have this kind of modified overhand grip. I have it secured between my fingers here, but stabilizing it with these fingers so that I have some more precision. I'm trying to visualize the path, but rather than draw it, I'm building it up as a series of these vertical marks. And that's going to actually help me to simulate the trees themselves. If I make this too heavy of a line, there's a chance that it'll feel artificial and really pop forward, and I'll lose some of that depth. Because this is really broken down as kind of background, middle ground, and foreground. And so my goal right now is to really solidly place this in the middle ground. So to help me kind of visualize that path, I'm just kind of moving my pencil over the page to kind of see that arc. There's this gentle angle in here. I didn't mean to drop that on the page there, but if you do make a line, try to get rid of that outline. It's going to serve you in the end in terms of creating depth. All right. So just utilizing really kind of the weight of the pencil. Actually, I'm going to apply a little bit more pressure, but this isn't as dark as I can get with this material. And I'm going to block in this again. So thinking about, one of the things I like to do is when I'm working from photograph, the reason I kind of started this series is to help me practice my drawing so that I become more adept in my plein air painting work. So then when I'm out on location, in a location like this painting, that I can utilize my drawing skill a little bit more heavily. So I always kind of think about, what would happen if I was on location right now. And one of the things that you kind of layer on top of an understanding of value as it creates depth and contrast, the idea that high contrast advance, low contrast recedes, is then also what happens in a temperature shift. So in the foreground, the the yellows and oranges become more prominent, and those wavelengths of light fall away as they recede, leaving the kind of blues and violets left in the landscape to become more visible. And so it's kind of interesting to see that here, as you can see that, you know, those greens in the foreground, they have a higher amount of yellow that's present, and then those yellows are essentially gone in that background. So just kind of something to think about as you're working. You know, I'd always learned that, you know, areas of, you know, like warmer colors advance and cooler colors recede, but it took me a long time to really understand what that meant. And as soon as I started to think about it in terms of just yellow wavelengths dropping at a distance, then it started to click for me. So I just use less yellow when I'm working in that background than I do in the foreground, yellows and oranges. So I'm kind of blocking in these shapes here, and I'm seeing these, there are kind of three bands that are created in this area, and I want to make sure that they're not kind of the same size. When I look at them, this is a little bit smaller, this gets larger, and then this is a little bit smaller as well. And so I want that variety to become apparent in the drawing. Because if they're too similar in size, it's just going to flatten things out. It's going to work against me. It's really going to pop those shapes of the surface. All right. Actually, I'm gonna drop this down in value as well. So not a lot of detail, but you can start to see depth being created here. And drop that down even more in value. I've got these trees here, and I want to do the same over on this side. So what I'm going to do is just kind of start by roughing in that form, and then I'm going to gradually make it more precise. Because in this area here, there's actually kind of multiple layers. There's this kind of immediate, I don't even know what term that's, not foreground, but it's not quite the middle ground, but there's kind of a transition between this area and this. And so I'm going to kind of darken this area in here, and then go even darker with some of those dark trees in that foreground. And so then I'm just kind of keeping in mind that as we advance in the drawing, the darkers get darker, the lighters get lighter, they can get more intense. I'm kind of smudge this out. Hello from Brooklyn. Medieval Peasant is asking Horizon. I'm curious if you have more to that. So in this case, like the horizon line is generally obscured by these mountainsides, these hillsides here. So I kind of want to change this angle here. See how that holds up. Yeah, and as I get darker in here, I think it's really going to start to push these hills even farther back. And I do wonder if I need to push. I think I do need a little bit more detail back in there. Feels a little too unfinished. But before I do that, what I'm going to do is I'm still using this 3B, which is fairly dark, but not super dark, and I'm going to kind of suggest some of these trees. So I'm using this kind of overhand grip, kind of placing some marks here, and it's just these short kind of vertical squiggles kind of combined with these horizontal kind of squiggles to suggest those trees. And I'm not worried about getting each individual tree 100% accurate. I'm just want to suggest them, in general, what those forms are. So what you want to be careful with, though, is creating kind of perfectly evenly spaced marks as you make these trees, making each tree identical to one another. Instead, you want there to be variety, and look for kind of larger forms. Now, doing a little bit of negative drawing in that, I'm also, as I'm working on the shape of these trees, I'm looking at this bottom edge, because that's being overlapped by these kind of scrub brush here. So I want that negative space to kind of align with what I'm observing in that scrub brush. So it's kind of with those trees, this combination of these kind of vertical and horizontal marks. And then we've got this larger tree right in here. And I find it helpful to think about those forms kind of from the inside out. So rather than outlining it, then filling it in, starting from the center of the form, working my way out to find the shape that I want. But I think I do want to, as I'm looking at this, now that I have like that darker value in there, I'm looking at that background, and it does feel too unfinished to me. So I want to go back and work on that. So I want to drop in some of these forms here while I'm still working on it, and I might have to go back to that H pencil. And I think it can be helpful too to not think about these dark marks as trees. to not be thinking trees. Just think about the shapes as much as possible. It's a tall, thin shape. What happens at the base of the shape, and react to that form, and trust that if you follow that as a guide, you'll end up with something that looks like a tree, as opposed to kind of relying on a preconceived notion about what a tree looks like and how to draw the tree, etc. So yeah, just do your best with them. I'm just kind of quickly dropping them in. Again, thinking about them as shapes and forms. And I'm just going to wash this whole thing, drop it down in value. All right, so now I'm going to switch back to my H. Actually, you know what I can do is go to my 2H, a little bit harder than what I had before. And I just want to sharpen up some of these edges in here to really make it feel more finished. I need, it's there, it's present, the eye gets drawn to it, but it feels a little unsatisfying to have it so kind of out of focus and unfinished. So I'm going to go in there and kind of finish it up. And so what I'm thinking about are kind of smaller circular marks that are a little bit softer, and I'm not utilizing kind of directional marks as much. And what's nice is that with this subsequent layer, the one that's a little bit closer to us, it's darker in value, so I can go right over the edge here. I don't really have to preserve that edge, and it creates a nice clean edge there. So what I want now is I want to suggest some of these kind of little trees in here. So is anybody following along? How's your drawing coming? Anybody stuck anywhere? Nia is asking, the scene behind me in the easel, is it done a marker, or is it, that's an oil painting. That's a recent one that I've done. was of a sunset in my old neighborhood that I just came across that photo, so I thought I'd use it as an opportunity to explore some fun color transitions. All right. See how the mountain edge goes directly to the horizon line? Yeah, so generally the horizon line is going to be somewhere right around down here. That's, the horizon line equates to your eye level when you're looking parallel with the ground plane. I think actually what I need to do is I need to get some of those clouds established, because I think that's going to throw me off. So utilizing the kneaded eraser now, it creates a little bit softer mark. I can do some negative drawing, refining the mountainsides. And the kneaded eraser just creates a little bit softer of an edge than the rubber eraser. So how does that work? I kind of like that. I'm lifting up some of this. I'm not worried about preserving this edge. I know I can get that back. So with the kneaded eraser, what I'm doing is I'm kind of pinching it into this blade that I can use to refine that edge, and then lifting and pulling away, kind of feathering it out a little bit. Now I'm going to end up having to revisit this. We've talked a bit about this before. I'm not really patient enough to kind of finish an area and then try to protect it. I know that at some point this is all going to get kind of messed up. And so I'm just going to keep reworking it as I need to. And then in general, I found that that leads to kind of a richer drawing, is to kind of bring an area back to life a little bit. Kind of suggest those clouds. I mean, that kind of passes kind of behind this mountainside. All right, how's that read? It works all right for now. I'll kind of work that sky a little bit more, but that helps me to kind of refine the edges a bit. I'm feeling that the limitations of this setup right now is that I can't quite contort myself the way I want to. All right, how's that reading right there? All right. Yeah, it gives me a little bit more to kind of, for the viewer's eyes to kind of sink their teeth into back in here. So I'm glad I went back, and I may end up going back and do it a little bit more, kind of tweaking it as we finish up the drawing. But I do want to move this drawing along a little bit faster. So we're almost an hour into it, and there's still a ways to go. But you can see, again, just kind of limiting the value range. The darkest dark in this area is still very, very light. I'm just kind of using this pencil as a way to really kind of blend, essentially, into that area. This texture is bothersome, so I'm going to put away my 2H. I'm going to just kind of blend this all together. It's leaving a little bit of a halo here that I want to get rid of. And just that right where it gets a little bit lighter up against that edge. And that, to me, just kills the depth, seeing those halos. All right. I'm going to go back to the 3B. Just gonna make this even darker. Really, I need to bring that forward a bit more. One of the challenging things is when you're looking at highly saturated colors, there's a tendency to interpret them as lighter in value than they actually are. So I'm kind of forcing myself to go a little bit darker. And here I see some of these greens are a little bit more intense, and I'm going darker there than I really feel comfortable with. My instinct is to go lighter to kind of simulate the saturation of that green. But all right, so this is gonna, I think I'm just gonna let that be for now. And I'm thinking about some of that negative space. And what is bothering me now? I think this is bothering me, that this is so light in value. So I'm kind of just doing a wash. It's a term taken from kind of watercolor or pen and ink drawing, where you're just kind of building up value across a whole area. I can use my eraser to refine that later, so I'm not worried about that too much. All right, so now kind of working again from the foreground, from the background into that foreground, I can come back into this area and intensify that a little bit more. I'm going to sharpen up right in here. Just these short vertical marks that help to simulate the trees. And it kind of blocked in, but then I'm looking for these patterns of these darker spots that are where I can really kind of lean into that pencil a little bit more. We have this lighter area, and then it gets darker towards the top of the mountain, and then it gets kind of washed out in some of the haze a little bit. So I'm going to let this be a little bit softer in value. Need to refine this shape in here. I may actually have to sharpen a pencil. I don't know if I've really ever sharpened a pencil intentionally. It's part of the series. I usually stay with a pencil as it is throughout the entire drawing. So just utilizing the side of the pencil, just these short vertical kind of stabs that will help to read as trees from a distance. So what I'm looking for, there's these kind of patterns of dark, these gaps in the trees that create these dark patches, and that's what I'm kind of looking for in this stage. So I see some more in this area, for example. And I don't know if it's really picking up, but again, it's just these really short kind of vertical vibrations that I find read more naturally than if I were to switch to this tripod grip and use these marks like this. Really utilizing the point of the pencil. Because what I want to do is prioritize natural looking marks over an exact duplication of the photograph. I'm going to create the impression of it, of that experience. And I think in my mind, you can create a portrait of a space. You can tell the story of a space more in getting the main forms right, and then needing to really get all the fine details 100% accurate. If you get the main forms in, you can get away with a lot in terms of interpreting that space. Hopefully that makes sense. JC is following on using gray toned paper. Nice. Nia is saying that you're struggling with landscape, with your landscape work. Yeah, I think that the big thing that I learned in landscape is to really step back from your work. I have the benefit, again, of looking in front of me at the overhead camera. It's the equivalent of stepping back about 20 feet because it's been reduced to the small scale. What happens when I'm this close, again, is because of our brains are always kind of calibrating to value relationships. I'm interpreting things differently, and it's really easy to make a drawing that works great up close and then just falls apart and is completely flat at a distance. So spend more time looking at it from a distance, and that might help you to really analyze what's going on in terms of your value structure. So I'm really laying down the value in here. So as I'm thinking about advancing along this hillside with this being farther away than this, so I can get a little bit darker, I can get heavier with my darks in this foreground area. I'm going to build up an area. I'm interpreting it to see if I'm running these marks this way, which could cause me trouble. If those marks are too strong, it could work against me. So then I'm going to come back in on top with these shorter vertical marks that will simulate the trees. So just really allow the trees to be suggested in the space rather than really making them explicit. Let the materials do some of the work for you. It's just like, just like in painting, when you might be using just the natural, work of the brush that is creating to simulate, simulate the textures here. Kind of like this tree line along this ridge, so I'm going to try to drop some of that edge in there, darkening the space behind it. All right, let's see, how's that reading? I'm going to wipe this down, unify it all. Now if I switch to this tripod grip, I can get some more precise lines in there as I need to. I'm worried that that's going to get too dark. It's hard. Everything looks a little bit different on the screen than it does here in front of me. So I may end up having to lighten this. I think it's working all right for me now. All right, Jerry's welcome. Glad you could join us. Hope you're all having a good week. Everybody, hope is getting ready for tomorrow. And everybody is staying safe. All right, so as we work down in this area here, what do I need to do? Let me think out loud. I think there's some more kind of precise transitions between these groups of trees, between the evergreens and then some of the birches and cottonwoods that grow up here in the mountains. Let me switch back to this overhand grip. So I'm just thinking about some of the subtle variations in value back in here. And as I'm doing that, my eyes are also switching back and forth between squinting and focus. Because when you focus on something, we actually get really good at seeing detail. So the center of our field of vision is really primed to see detail and sharp edges. But it's not quite as effective in seeing color and value relationships. That is actually best just outside of your center of vision. And so you might find it more helpful to use kind of an indirect method of interpreting your values. So if I'm looking at this area in the reference photo, I'm fixing on it, I'm putting my awareness in the area around it. So just kind of offsetting a little bit from your center of vision can sometimes give you a better understanding of the real color and value relationships. And it just has to do with the way our eyes are structured and the way the rods and cones are organized in our retina. So how we focus that light on our retina will you know, will change how we interpret those scenes there. So, so a lot of what I'm doing is kind of really indirect observations, looking at things just slightly askew. And then always kind of, my eyes are always in and out of focus because you want that variation. The more we stay fixed and focused on something, the worse we get at being an observer. Okay, there's this kind of foreground bush here that I want to kind of suggest down in here. So, and also as I'm working, I'm trying to do a check-in with where I am relative to other features in the landscape. Oh, Jerry's is asking, yes, this is a Derwent graphic. I'm on the 3B right now. And I think I'm going to switch to the 2B. It's just sharper. And I don't want to stop and sharpen my pencil. And it's very close in value to the 3B, so I can kind of get away with it. One of the things I have too that's really helpful is I have this bar here on the drawing table that I can rest my arm on, and then that helps me. It helps serve as a horizontal guide as I move across the drawing. And there's some of these kind of darker lines. And I have to remind myself, you know, I have these initial forms in there, but these aren't kind of locked in yet. I want there to be some. I'm going to need to adjust the proportions a little bit as I move down, as I come forward in the landscape. All right, so there's this. So you can see in the reference photo, there's this group of kind of trees that are closer to us. They're still in the middle ground, but they're a little bit closer. And I'm looking at them in relationship to this hill line, so a plumb line there. And there's kind of a patch of this kind of scrub brush. And then they're on this hillside, so the bases have like these angles to them, these slants. So you kind of keep checking in as you come forward in the drawing as you advance. So you can kind of just check your proportions. Let's see. And then again, what I'm doing is there's some areas that are appearing a little bit off in terms of their proportions, but before I go in and fix them, I'm kind of assessing whether or not it's a big deal. whether I just want to let it be. Does it still read as a convincing landscape is what my main objective is. Something seems, I guess this angle, doing some angle sighting just to double check this hillside. So again, I have the drawing in front of me, so I'm carrying my angle from this reference photo off to my left, laying it on top of my drawing right now to see what this angle is. And I'm feeling pretty confident in it. And then looking at this, okay, there's this general angle this way. There's just too great of contrast in this area, so utilizing the side of the pencil, I'm blocking that in. And then I can get even darker in some of these areas where these trees are in shadow. And so as you think about shapes, just think about forms being, generally asymmetrical. Think about them not being spaced evenly. Those are ultimately going to read as more pleasant. We have a tendency to want to not only create evenly spaced marks, but see them in nature. And so that if you look more closely, you could start to see, like right now, these are pretty evenly spaced. I broke that pencil, so let me go back to my 3B. These are generally evenly spaced. Oh, that's being cut off, so you're not seeing that little bit over on this side. All right, so, but you know, just look at the forms again and try to see the variety as much as possible. And then there's me. Actually, this is a bit too much texture in here. So the other advantage to doing that is that it helps to lighten it up. This is a little bit dark. If I bring this down, you can see there's a slight difference in value between what I did in my preparatory drawing and then this one, how that's a little bit darker, and the one I'm working on now. But I think that's because over time, you kind of wipe this down, and that starts to lighten it up. And then again, I'm going to go back in and pull those clouds out again later, kind of save that tonal high end for later. Okay, so I want to establish the back end of the stream here. There's this little shadow in the grasses, and then these bushes fall in this shadow, and they form these clumps that look, on first glance, like they're a repetition of form, but they're not quite. And again, I'm thinking about starting from the center of those forms, working my way out, rather than creating an outline and filling it in. And that's ultimately I feel like it's going to lead. It's going to read better in the drawing. Okay. I'm going to work my way now across and kind of work on this ground plane. So what do I need to do? What do I need to do? I need to give myself some landmarks. So this intersection point is a nice landmark. If I drop a vertical line, a plumb line down here, I can see where it intersects this bush. So what I'm going to do is going to block this value in first. I'm going to darken everything, actually. Going to drop everything down in value, leaving this fairly light. And then go back in, and you can start to see these shadow forms on these bushes here. Working my way from the base outward and letting it just be kind of a rough edge. So it kind of has a bit of a sharper, harder edge at the bottom and then kind of trails up, if that makes sense. And again, this can be helpful just to continue to squint your eyes. And we're just suggesting those bushes. Our brain is perfectly primed to make sense of what appear to be just kind of randomly placed dots and shapes. And you can use your drawing, you create a drawing in such a way that you kind of leverage that and give the brain something to get excited by. If you make everything too explicit, then it can sometimes kind of initially be exciting, but it doesn't really give the brain much to do. And so I find that for me at least, it gets more exciting to kind of just suggest these forms. Like just a little dark wiggle there in the right spot, in the right context, can read as a bush, which just kind of blows my mind. And that's the magic of drawing, right? It's, I can't remember where I read, I think it was in the book Art and Fear, read this kind of description of art as being, a form of, illusion. It's like if you think about a stage magician, they can make things appear on stage, but the only difference is that it happens more slowly on the page than it does on stage. So, and I love that idea that, we can start from a blank piece of paper, and how we arrange our marks creates a landscape. We see a space, we can put ourselves there. Kind of goes back to Rene Magritte's "This is not a pipe" drawing or painting, where he really kind of makes that explicit. We're looking at a painting of a pipe, not the pipe itself, but our brain says that's a pipe. So now I'm just thinking about, trying to think about these as shapes, values, not trees. All right, I'm going to bring in this blending stump. going to change the direction of my mark. So if I run them vertically here, that'll help to distinguish the space in the drawing. If I run them horizontally here, there'll be a visual distinction that will help hopefully serve us. All right, so I'm thinking about the... All right, I want to get back to any questions. Nia saying you're having a hard time understanding how to use your shading stump or your blending stump properly. And I'm curious about that. Yeah, because we've talked about that here in this class. So like whether you have your eraser, whether you have your blending stump, it's always an opportunity to refine the form. And so the way I think about it is essentially just another pencil that happens to have some material on it. It's just a very light material. But as I'm working on it, I'm kind of rolling it in my fingers a little bit. And in this case, I'm thinking about both there's kind of two axes for this ground plane. Generally it's horizontal, but those grasses are growing up vertically. So if I hold it horizontally, kind of drag it across horizontally, but lift up at the same time. So it's kind of like a horizontal pull using vertical marks. It can simulate the texture of those grasses. And I'm going to come back in and erase out some of those highlights. I'm just kind of observing some of these bands of value as we recede across that ground plane. And that's all with the blending stump. Now I think I'm going to erase out some highlights here, but before I do that, I want to drop in the shadows. And so actually this is kind of cool. I just remember we talked earlier about how this area was going to get lost, and that's exactly what happened. That whole riverbank that we had established is now gone. That's awesome. So just squinting, I think I can start to establish that again. There's this patch of grass here, directly below this peak here. Again, these kind of short vertical marks using the side of the pencil. And there's just an irregularity to this technique that I really enjoy. Kind of rolling as I go. And I'm going to just kind of suggest this riverbank here, these grasses. This is all darker in value than this area here. And there's some areas that are in shadow that get a little bit darker. Right in here, this little shadow, the riverbank turns a little bit, comes out. I can't wait to get into the river part. That was actually a lot of fun to work on in the preparatory sketch. All right, Terry, it looks like you're making some progress for your for Thanksgiving. Terry, yes, the magic of drawing is the recreation of the world around us using nothing more than the marks in a flat medium. Yeah, absolutely. The illusion of depth, on a two-dimensional surface. I think it's very exciting to the brain. That feels too big. So it's cool. This is exactly what happened I was talking about earlier, is that I focused on this and it took up a larger portion of my mind than really takes up in the picture plane. So I look at it on the page, as I look at it in my periphery, that just looks huge. And so I need to kind of adjust that a little bit. But it's kind of a cool example of that, what I was saying earlier. Just kind of make that a little bit smaller. All right, and now I'm going to come up here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on kind of this horizontal line that forms this bank here. So I'm going to hold my pencil vertically, and I'm going to look at that path, and it's going to be largely horizontal. What I've seen other artists do, people who are kind of just getting new to it, and something that I battle myself with is seeing this riverbank line as an angle, and it is an angle, but making it too steep. So as we come up here, it's largely horizontal. But then it gets more steep as we move down the drawing. But there's a natural tendency to want to make it kind of tilt off to one side, and I've seen that happen, especially in kind of river scenes, that everything just feels slightly slanted. So it's just something to pay attention to. This is still the 3B. And then as you're following along this line, do a quick check-in to make sure you're orienting yourself properly. You're not getting just so consumed in that one line that everything else falls away. So I'm saying that out loud more to remind myself than anything. So as I'm moving across, I'm trying to think about where I am along this riverbank and where that is relative to the horizon line up there. There's kind of this dip right in here. So there's so much going on in this landscape, we're just going to suggest it as much as possible. All right, so there that bank is starting to form. Derry's got to run. All right, we'll see you. Thank you. If anybody has to go, this does go up as a recording when we're done. All right, so I think what I'm going to do now is focus on this grassy bank over here. And what I can do is I can see it as generally there's a face to it, a kind of a vertical plane that's generally darker, and then it turns and goes away from us where the light hits a little bit more strongly, so a little stronger. There's a bush that I want to put in here. And really what helps to create depth is, and you can see back in here, everything gets kind of squished into a small area. So just be careful not to open that up too much, because it can flatten things out. There's a lot going on there in terms of these bushes, and I think I'm just going to let that be because if I look at the drawing, it feels like it's a convincing sense of space. So if I'm missing a handful of bushes or details in there, I think that's okay. As long as it's believable and it feels like it's a continuation back into that space, really our eye is drawn back here and it's going to be drawn to the water. The bushes are largely afterthoughts. And so I think we can be a little bit forgiving of ourselves in terms of capturing all of those specific details. So I'm just kind of, I don't know why I felt compelled to work on those trees back there, but I did. Okay. I just wanted to give myself a little bit more definition in here. Okay. Joy is asking how I'm going to deal with the water. That is going to be so much fun. Stick with me in a little bit. I will get to it. Right now what I'm thinking about are just these grasses. So running these kind of short vertical squiggles here, but I don't want them to be I don't want them to read as stripes, you know, so you want to vary the form, have a visual rhythm to it all. And this is still the 3B pencil, so I can get darker. When I bring out that Onyx pencil, this one right here, we're going to get darker in value. Just kind of these short little squiggles. And one of the things I'm also trying to think about too is as we move across this ground plane, things get closer and closer together. So kind of tighter marks back in here, more open marks as we advance. And that's going to read more effectively as depth. So I'm just utilizing, again, the side of the pencil, rolling it in my fingers as I go. So like in this case, I'm moving this direction, but rolling this way. And they're generally vertical, but we can vary it. And I just want to see how that reads at a distance, and it reads okay right in here. And one of the reasons I kind of like this overhand approach to creating those marks is that I can rock the pencil a little bit, so it's really more of a scooping motion that I'm making. And so I don't end up with like this dot in a line down, right? It's soft in both directions. And it's harder to control, less precise, but I'm doing that on purpose. I want it to be less precise. I want it to do a certain amount of work, and let it just create abstract marks on the page that I think we'll interpret as those reads. Don't mock the medieval peasant. I would never mock the medieval peasant. I hope I wasn't. Happy to have medieval peasant here happy to have everybody here. It's one of the things I'm grateful for this year, and all the craziness that it's brought to everybody is this show and getting to work with you all every week. So thank you all for taking time out of your day to draw with me. It's so easy as artists to just kind of get locked in our studios, right? And I don't know, it's just nice to have everybody here. Okay, let's see. So that's suggesting, I think, those grasses pretty effectively. I think I need them along in here. And I think what I want to do is I've got this slim eraser that I can use, and I've carved it so it's got this sharp edge. And there are some areas in here where I feel like I can kind of suggest the light on it. So I'm keeping it kind of vertically aligned, but I'm kind of prioritizing this inner corner, just kind of tapping and dragging to lift off some of that, because I want these to, I don't want it to flatten out the texture. So there's kind of a vertical pull to it. I think I just need to have a little bit more contrast in here. See how that reads. All right, medieval peasant, I won't worry about what you're doing. All right. All right, thank you for the comments getting from you all. Yeah, it's nice to work on a landscape like this. I know we got snow the other day, and it's just harder and harder to get out and into the landscape. So I find myself in the studio a lot more, and kind of wishing I was wishing it was summer again, going out in the mountains. And all right, so part of what's happening with this eraser is it's also helping to kind of smudge and blend a little bit, kind of soften these transitions. But I feel like that's reading all right now, bringing a little bit more contrast to that ground plane. So what I'm assessing right now is if I'm here and I go to this spot, I'm going up about 1.5 inches on the paper, but I'm going back a 1/4 mile. Right? It's a healthy distance there. And so I want to assess how I feel about that. Does it read that way? Does it feel like I'm going back into that distance? One amazing example of that is, I always think about that when you're shearing across the landscape like this, is take a look at Frederick Church's rendering of Niagara Falls. And he's down really low, kind of right at the rim of the Horseshoe Falls. And there's a spot where you could just shoot across the Niagara River, up the river, and in there's this little cloud way off in the distance, and it feels like it's about 30 miles away. And on the picture plane, they're only like 1 inch apart. So you go from something that the edge of the waterfall, it feels like it's right there next to you, to this cloud that's 20 miles away, and they're just right next to one another. It's this amazing expression of depth across that plane. So just check that out when you get a chance. But all right, let's think about. Let's switch to the water now. Okay, so I'm gonna actually just stay with this 3B. It's got plenty of lead on it. Now I'm gonna run my marks horizontally. This is where this guide on the table is gonna help, because I can. It gives me a little bit of support. Using the overhand grip, I'm looking for those areas of dark, and it's very similar to the grasses, although it's just a kind of a smoother motion. And I'm looking. You can see it's darker in the shadow here along along that river bank, but there's a contrast between the vertical marks of the grass and the horizontal marks of the water. And then in here, it starts to get broken up a little bit. So before I work on that, I want to kind of give myself an orientation place. So I'm utilizing the landmarks in the landscape to kind of figure out where I'm at. And then I'm going to start to create this form. And it's just kind of light touch, running it horizontally. Until I build up that shape. And the river's flowing this direction, so I'm going to keep it horizontally, but bring it down along the path of the river. So it's kind of two motions at once. My hand is coming down this direction, but it's also moving back and forth horizontally. And then you can start to see these kind of river ripples across here. In this case, I'm really just pulling this way. So my hand is moving back and forth, but you're not able to see really where it's making contact. So I'm just kind of pulling back towards that riverbank. And I'm not worried about this riverbank. I'm going to come back in and kind of clean that up a little bit later. What I'm looking at are the way those waves form, these ripples, and they kind of curl around in this part here. And as I come across here, I kind of stay horizontally, and it's just this kind of dark form. It kind of feathers out, but there's kind of a rough texture to it. So what I'm essentially just doing is allowing the pencil to kind of react to my observations about the general direction and shape of these marks. And as we come down here, they kind of become, they kind of make these kind of diamond patterns. in the dark, so they kind of come in this direction and then up. But again, utilizing the side of the pencil to create that, letting it roll in my fingers as I go, rather than using the point of the pencil to make explicit marks. If I do this, if I switch to this grip and I make a mark on the page, it's really going to pop to the surface. It's not going to feel like a natural form. And so even though I'm not matching the reference photo one-to-one, I want to make the marks feel similar to what I'm observing. Where they get tighter, make tighter marks. Where they open up, open it up a little bit more. So, and if thinking about what happens in the region, so if I'm in this area of the river, what do those marks feel like they're doing? And as I work my way across to this region, what do those marks feel like they're doing? And so constantly be checking in as you move across the drawing, and don't get sucked into just the sheer pleasure of making marks on the page. It's so easy to do that. And I've done that so many times before. I'm like, oh, I like these marks, and I just fill the whole page with those marks. And then it doesn't really work, because as you follow along the path of the river, it's always changing. You know, it's dark here because it's a little bit more shallow. And so the ripples are kind of hitting a wall there and then smoothing out behind this shallow patch up in this area. And so then it starts to reflect those mountains a little bit more. But a large part of what creates both the water and really texture of any kind is to think about the path that you need to make, and then running your marks in an opposing direction. So as I see a dark ripple moving this direction, I might create it as a series of marks that run in another direction, right? And then as we come along here, the water kind of gets caught along that bank, and it changes direction a little bit. And this, I'm just placing it, kind of rocking into it and pulling into that shoreline. So hopefully that makes sense. And we're going to I'm going to pull out the highlights pretty soon. And when I do that with the eraser, I'm going to be kind of thinking in that same vein in terms of the mark making, because I can feel myself already calibrating to this, seeing this as light when I know I can actually erase out much brighter. All right. How's that read? Let's see. So let's pull out the eraser now. I'm going to have it kind of sharpened up. I'm going to start in this background. I kind of lost my orientation with this. Let's see. There is this bush here. Come down, there's this line of grass there. And then right underneath it, that's where the water is. So I'm just going to pull out that line. And then it's pretty light in here. Going to drag down into that. We hit a dark patch right in here again where the water kind of smooths out. I'm going to drop that in with this. And then we hit the reflections again. So I'm keeping in mind, even though I have the eraser here, I'm treating it just like I did the pencil. This is where that grass I made too big. Actually, I'm just going to erase right over that grass, because then I can draw that in on top of it in a bit. So if anything, I want to be careful of these marks kind of running in this direction. If anything, I want to tilt them up slightly from this direction across that, almost like a perspective grid across that river. And that'll ultimately feel more natural. It's not going to make it feel like the water is tilting off. And then there's sections here where the reflections get kind of broken up. So now this just becomes kind of an opposite approach to what I was just doing with the graphite. Now I'm just kind of erasing out the highlights there. It's a little bit choppier down in here. We get some really strong kind of highlights on this portion of the river. But again, I'm just kind of reacting. I'm not really overthinking it. As I look at the reference photo, I think, all right, what marks are standing out? What kind of direction of the marks do I feel compelled to go? And then just trusting it. And doing that frequently, really kind of checking in all the time so I don't get kind of sucked into, again, repeating that mark over and over again. And there's some kind of ripples that seem to move the other direction here. But the advantage of allowing that tone to build up on the page is then I can erase out these portions. You know, if I had tried to preserve that white of the page, I wouldn't really have this opportunity. All right. So let's get back to, I got my 3B again. And I am going to kind of suggest some of the forms on this side of the riverbank, because it gets a little abstract in this area. So I want to clean that up. All right, again, I get this kind of bush in here again. Those grasses there that. We have the ground plane in here. It kind of creates this cut in here, and then let's see. Oh, I can erase out a little bit where the sticks might be. I'm not giving it a whole lot of thought because we are we're an hour and 45 minutes into this, so I want to get this thing moving along. So some of these sticks are not quite right. That's okay by me. I just want to kind of get them suggested. Get that shadow underneath it. Kim S. is the first time drawing. All right, I'm glad it's going smoothly for you. Let's see. I want to be careful of this becoming too straight, so now, like suggesting the rocks can be a lot of fun. There's some texture already in the paper that you can kind of utilize, and just kind of, if you go in and reinforce some of those dark spots, it automatically suggests kind of the light and shadow of those pebbles on the ground. And so even though it may not match the reference one-to-one, that's utilizing the materials to suggest that texture. So I'm just kind of dropping in little hints of these shadows for those pebbles, and that can sometimes be enough to kind of create that impression. And then it gets a little bit darker on this side, so I can really kind of lean in on that a little bit more in that mud. That's kind of off the page. I realize that it's been cropped, so you're not seeing a whole lot happen right now, so I apologize for that. All right. So, and like I said, we're coming up on 2 hours, so I do want to wrap this up a little bit. And so it's not quite as finished as I think the one that I did earlier, but hopefully it's enough to give you a sense of what the process could look like if you're, or if you're following along, how you might continue to work on it. The last thing I want to do now is go to my Onyx, which will allow a greater degree of depth in those darks. And so, as we mentioned earlier, this is kind of about that atmospheric perspective where we work with low contrast in the background, high contrast in the foreground, so we get darker darks here in that foreground area. So that's what I'm going to lay in here, is looking to those areas along that riverbank where it gets really dark in there. But I don't want that to read as a hard line. It's being overlapped by those brushes, the bushes there, and the grass. It's hard to see. I'm getting a little bit of glare on my paper because of the studio lights. But if I look in the screen, what you're seeing, it's a little bit better. So I'm actually going to be working from that. And I feel like that really helps to bring that forward, because I want, this is so much closer than this hillside and way closer than what's back in there. And so this is one of the final steps here, is just to bring in the darkest parts. And so this is darker in value than even those dark trees back there. Ooh, I leaned in on that one a little bit too much. That's all right. So this is a little bit tricky along this dark edge here, because the bottom edge is the water and the top edge is the grass. And so I'm kind of pushing up into the grass area and then pulling across into the water. And that's what ultimately is creating that edge. If anybody needs anything to listen to, I usually listen to podcasts when I work. I'm a through and through podcast addict. We do have Artbound. That is a fantastic one. I'm really excited with some of the episodes we had there, and you can find them actually on our YouTube channel if you want to listen to them there. It's cool. Doug, the host, he brings in 2 guests for each episode, and so you get kind of differing opinions and perspectives on certain topics, and that might be something that you find inspiring while you work. All right, so what am I doing right in here? I'm going to bring that forward, and I feel like these grasses need a little bit more attention in here, just because they're in that foreground. So I'm going to do a little bit of negative drawing with the eraser, and help kind of work that texture a little bit more. I feel like it's a little too bright. So I can knock that down a little bit. So this is where I'm kind of switching to the tripod grip and just flicking the wrist up to create these grasses. I don't want to get too bogged down in the details, but you may find, if you've got time to really sit with the subject, you can go back in and start to refine some of these areas. I feel like it's working effectively now as an unrefined drawing in some of them, but this right in here, this halo, is bothering me. So one of the nice things is that we have this dark area, so I can work on this all day long, and it's not doing a thing. But it does fill in some of that halo that was there. And I do want to create a little bit more differentiation along in here. Just remember that I do have the 3B. Phew, I was thinking I had the Onyx in my hand, which would have been perhaps a bit too dark. And so now I can go back through and add a little bit of detail wherever I feel compelled. And I've lost the clouds, so I need to get those back. So I'm going to use that kneaded eraser again. This area here gets pretty light. Those clouds kind of peek up and behind there. Kind of refine the edges a bit and create the highlights. And I'm really thinking about creating just irregular marks in here that follow generally the direction of the clouds rather than thinking about drawing them as clouds. Because when I think about them, drawing them as clouds, then my instinct is to make like these bubble-like forms. And that's not at all what we're seeing in this reference, this day that we were up there in the mountains. These were these kind of wispy clouds here. So kind of tapping, rolling, keep mushing the kneaded eraser so that it changes its shape and it creates more irregular forms so I don't get kind of a stamping pattern as I go across it. And I kind of break up that space up there with a little bit of a cloud. But hopefully this has helped you all in some way to think about atmospheric perspective and really think about it in terms of these kind of keys, these value keys. So, you know, the lights and the darks are very close together in this background, and you just increase the contrast as you come forward. So preserving your darkest darks and your lightest lights in general for that foreground area. At least the darkest darks. You know, sometimes, you know, you just can't go any brighter than the sky. Sometimes the sky itself is just the brightest part of the drawing. But you know, at least with the darks, they lose their intensity over distance. So I'll let that happen in your drawing as well. All right. Medieval peasant saying, Colorado. Yes, this is in Colorado somewhere. And for the life of me, I cannot remember where. All right, I'm going to switch to this. Actually, go back to the 3H in here. So I just feel like this edge needs to be sharpened up a little bit. So just keeping those marks gentle because I don't want there to be a line. I want it to read as an edge. And you don't want it to be consistently hard across the entire, across that entire mountain line. But there's just a few areas where it gets sharper, I think will help pull the eye back there. And then using that 3H kind of ensures that I don't get too dark with it. So yeah, kind of coming back in this a little bit just to add a little bit more detail, something to rest the eye on as we recede into the distance. So we'll meet next week. Oh yeah, I was working on this. We're going to be doing this portrait of a girl next week. She's going to have this kind of light, kind of halo around her hair with backlight. So that's going to be it's a fun subject, focusing on that backlight. But so I want to thank you all. I'm going to hang out for a little bit more, see if I can answer any additional questions you might have. And I hope you all share your work. I forgot all about that. Yes, so if you look in the description, you'll find a link to Artist Network where you can go to the show page. It'll be directly to the show page for this episode, and you can share the work that you might have created as you're following along. If you are joining us, my name's Scott Maier, and I am an artist here with Artist Network. We meet every Wednesday, 3 p.m. Eastern. We draw together a different subject each week. Well, generally, I've revisited a few subjects to kind of test those skills a little bit. But the idea is that we get together, challenge ourselves with new subjects, new processes. I am experimenting with different drawing materials. I don't quite feel confident in that, and I don't want to take the ego hit So I'll be very upfront about that, but that's why I haven't done any kind of colored pencil or any other real kind of drawing material. So it's largely graphite and charcoal, but I hope that we'll be doing some other drawing media as well at some point. Mukhtar, yeah, Mukhtar, I saw you in Johannes's class yesterday. Welcome. We have another show called Painting Together that we're not meeting tomorrow because of the holiday here in the United States. But, you know, Gigi has a show on Thursdays, Painting Together in acrylics. So, all right. There, I feel better about that now. There's some structure back there. There feels like there's more going on there, and it still is receding into the distance. How's everybody else feeling? Mukhtar is saying, yeah, colored pencil. I will definitely try to work in colored pencil. That stuff is hard, and I have a lot of respect for those colored pencil artists out there. So there we go. I think that works out all right. My brain feels fried at this point. What's missing? So I'm just doing a quick check-in, and I feel like what's missing is really just more definition in this area here. That shoreline is just undefined. So I'm going to drop something in there that helps to make that feel a little bit more defined there. But thank you all for joining. Again, if you are new, this is Drawing Together. My name's Scott, and this is Artist Network. You'll find the reference image in the description below, so you can follow along. This does go up as a recording later, so you can kind of follow along as I go. But I also like to see how you all make it your own, and so share your work with us at Artist Network. Go to the episode page. I'd love to see it there. Have a great weekend, everybody. Greg, you have a good Thanksgiving as well. Monica, yes, I would love to do a colored pencil one, and I'd love to see your work there. So thank you all. I'm going to sign off, let this run for a little bit so I can catch any additional questions, but I think you get the point. This is a lot of fun. Feels good to kind of imagine myself back up in the mountains, and hopefully I can get up there again sometime soon. So have a great weekend. Enjoy tomorrow for those of you celebrating Thanksgiving. Have a great week. See you next week.